What we're trying to investigate is the extent to which this series of interconnected changes, particularly rapid technological change, but also the climate crisis and things like pandemics that are all different but somehow related, whether they are buzzing around in a sort of febrile fever that might reflect some kind of change in the way that we live our lives. Do you see, as I do, complicated domains that are changing very, very quickly, or are we overreading what we're seeing?
Well, if you went into the typical windowless room full of professional chatter merchants from the various elites of the world, the financial elite, the academic elite, the political elite, and you ask that kind of question, I think the answers would include, well, there is some huge paradigm shift happening in the global climate that will have terrible consequences. There are technological changes, particularly in the area of artificial intelligence, that are exponential with the rapid growth of large language models. And it's all very scary. And somebody will say, because we're in a polycrisis and everything is happening all at once. And this is unprecedented, which just means they don't know any history. So let's just run a thought experiment. Supposing you and I were having this conversation with somewhat different technology in 1923 rather than 2023. I'm sure that there would be somebody in the windowless room who would say, well, we just had a tremendous pandemic in 1918-19 and a huge conflict. The world is being driven crazy by inflation. And then there are these alarming breakthroughs in technology that are producing moving pictures, cinema, and it feels like they would have had some sense of impending disaster. And I think we have to therefore guard against saying things that were also being said 100 years ago, and indeed might have been said 50 years ago. And if you'd had a conversation like this in 1973, you would have all kinds of reasons to think that the world was going to hell in a handcart. So I think the first thing to do is beware of assuming that the year you happen to be in is hugely historically significant, because it might not be.
Well, every year in a sense is unprecedented.
Yeah.
Unprecedented things are actually quite common in life.
And most of the things that are happening in this particular year aren't drastically different from the things that struck people as worrying 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So I'll dissent a bit from conventional wisdom by trying to highlight the things that I think really are important about now, because most of the things we attach significance to turn out not to be important. In the early 70s, people thought a huge population crisis was coming, and this was the dominant view.
If I can jump in though, if we look back over the long arc of history, we can see moments where there were these paradigm shifts. You can see England, the economy of England looks very, very different in 1750 to how it looked 150 years earlier before the discovery and exploitation of coal. If we look at the structure of power and economies in Europe in the 200 years after the printing press, they look quite different to how they looked just 100 years before the printing press. There are perhaps not annual moments, but there are a dozen where we can start to say, these look like turning points. So we know they exist in history.
You've mentioned two, and you'll struggle to come up with five, because the Industrial Revolution is one of the very rare moments where human history resembles the hockey stick. There is a really exponential change in economic life. It starts, of all places, in the British Isles in the 18th century, and it spreads gradually to the rest of the world, and it involves a massive enhancement of human productivity through technology. The printing press is the thing that transforms communication in the 16th and 17th century. Again, it happens in Western Europe and then gradually spreads to the rest of the world. So let's ask ourselves, is it plausible that something like that has happened in our time? And the answer is it has, because the internet has had about the same impact in our lifetimes as the printing press had over a more prolonged period.
How do you measure the impact of the internet?
If you simply compare the cost of communication, it was reduced as much by the internet as it was by the printing press. It's as big a transformation in the ease of communication.
Right.
So that has happened. And in a way, it's sort of reaching some natural frontier, a point of diminishing returns.
We'll run out of people to connect.
We almost so the kind of paradigm shift happened. We're really looking back on it now.
Well, there's something else that I think is quite interesting about the spread of the internet, because when it started to spread, the idea was that it would energize local democracy, it would energize the individual, it would give us all a voice. And up until the point of the Arab Spring, you could make that case. And a decade on, we've seen that democracy didn't take root. And we've also seen that these new non-state actors in the form of the platforms have found ways of sequestering the democratic capability of the internet into something that doesn't look too dissimilar to mass media with a little hint of Orwell.
I think the same kind of disappointment arose with the rise of the printing press. I mean, there certainly was a moment when it seemed as if the advent of very cheap printed books would allow Christian doctrine to spread everywhere very rapidly, and this was very exciting. But what in fact happened was that once Martin Luther started to argue for improvements in Western Christendom, you had about 100 plus years of very violent religious warfare. And in the same way, we thought everything would be awesome if everybody was connected on network platforms, Google, Amazon, and the rest. It took us a few years to realize that there might be downsides to a much enhanced interconnectivity. That if we'd only studied the history of the printing press more thoroughly, we wouldn't have been surprised to find the polarization and other pathologies that have arisen from the rise of the internet. So I think that kind of thing illustrates why you need to study history if you're not to misunderstand the paradigm shifts of your time. The thing that I would add that might turn out to be comparable is the rise of artificial intelligence.
Right, exactly.
I mean, that does feel like something that's really transformative.
Well, it looks like it's a technology that could dramatically improve productivity. So when we go back to England in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, you saw the start and then the deployment of machines that looked at human work and magnified it, multiplied it. And when we start to look at these very, very early large language models, they've only been publicly available for a matter of months. And we're already seeing how knowledge workers who make up a very large portion, certainly of Western countries' employment bases, are able to use them to magnify their work. So I do wonder about whether artificial intelligence has some of the characteristics of the kind of technology that can be a pivotal point in our development.
Well, let's hope so. I mean, that's certainly plausible when we look at something like AlphaFold, which has allowed a far, far more rapid analysis of proteins than was possible before. And I think in medical science, the case is already clearly proven that there are huge benefits.
It could be that given that we have this productivity enhancing technology that is AI, that has come off the back of this transformative communications network that's the internet. We also have radical improvements in certain biotechnologies, and we have a fundamental shift in the way the energy system is working as we move from extractive sources through to renewable sources, and these renewable...
You mean other extractive resources, because renewables involve extraction.
But the ratio of extraction to useful energy is much, much more in favor of renewables than it is with oil and gas. And that feels like the energy system could also change. So there could be the ingredients of a pivot point of a kind that we've only seen a couple of times previously in history.
But let's ask what the driving forces will be. The world is propelled forward and has been for thousands of years by great power competition.
That's right.
And that is the thing that drives innovation right now across the board, whether it's in solar panels or in artificial intelligence. It is a competition which is intensifying between two superpowers, the United States and a communist-led superpower. Now, is this starting to sound familiar?
It does.
So what is really significant about this historical moment is that we are in the first inning, the early phase of Cold War II.
Right.
And that is going to drive all the things that we've talked about, and it will not necessarily drive these changes in directions that are benign. That the big technological advance of Cold War I was, of course, nuclear weapons. And I don't believe for a minute that we can have a Cold War II without a similar risk. And in fact, you can already see how Cold War II is repeating Cold War I in a number of key respects. One of which is it has its hot aspects. There's a hot war going on right now in Ukraine, which you can think of as analogous to the hot war in Korea that broke out in 1950. The Cuban Missile Crisis in this Cold War will be a Taiwan semiconductor crisis. And in that sense, I think if you try to imagine yourself as a future historian, you'll be writing about how the US-China rivalry, both ideological and technological, produced moments of great risk before the superpowers found out a way of managing it better.
I think it's always the case, though, that breakthroughs in technology will lead to great power competition. I mean, the square-rigged sails resulted in those expeditions from the Iberian Peninsula that started that wave of colonization. Steel and larger bore guns turned into competition in Europe when we got to World War I.
Well, it's the other way around, actually, Azim. It's actually the competition that leads to the technological development. The reason that there's so much more technological innovation in Europe than in China from around 1500 is that there are relatively evenly matched states engaged in a competition, whereas it's not like that in China, where there is one very large empire and it doesn't really have to wage war with peers. Peer-to-peer conflict incentivized European states to innovate with shipbuilding and particularly to innovate with artillery. And in the same way, it's clearly the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that propels innovation with nuclear weapons. And in the same way today, I think the United States and China are in a race with respect to artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and a whole range of other technologies. Because once you're in that great power competition, you cannot afford to lose technological leadership.
But the current competition between China and the US started with civil applications of these technologies. So it's been a case of plowshares into swords. We were not developing AI or genome sequencing first and foremost for military advantage. We were developing them for their innovation capacities, which would lead to economic advantage.
And Chinese scientists and American scientists were cooperating in all kinds of domains in a relatively short space of time, up until, I guess, Xi Jinping came to power in China and Donald Trump came to power in the United States. People in the United States really underestimated the extent to which almost all the technologies were potentially dual use. That is to say, they had civilian but also military usages. They underestimated the extent to which their own military hardware, US military hardware, had Chinese components.
Something else happened between 2007 and about 2015, which was in technology, things that we now called AI went from being slightly mundane and not usable to suddenly quite useful.
I think historically, technological innovation sometimes seems like its own story that's somewhat separate from everything else. In the 1930s, the world was in the grip of the worst depression in modern economic history. But if you look closely, quite a lot of innovation was happening in the US economy that would turn out to be enormously consequential once there was actually growth again. In the 1970s, most people thought that the world was in stagflation, but that was actually the decade when Microsoft and Apple were founded.
And Intel was building chips for the very first time and so on.
And that turned out to really matter in Cold War I because the Soviets were able to steal and copy the technology of nuclear weapons, also space flight. But when it came to copying microprocessors, they utterly failed. Even though they could steal them, they couldn't work out how really to replicate Moore's law. And I think in that sense, what happened in the 1970s in Silicon Valley turned out to be strategically hugely important once the Soviets realized that the next generation of weapons would depend on microprocessors and computers. That's why, from a technological point of view, they couldn't possibly win Cold War I. Now, Cold War II, I think, has similar characteristics.
It does.
It's going to be decided at the technological frontier. At the moment, there are two respects in which I think this is much closer than Cold War I. Number one, obviously, the Chinese economy is bigger than the Soviet economy ever was. I mean, it was 44% of US GDP at peak and falling away from the mid-1970s. China overtook the US in 2014 on a purchasing power parity basis. It's not that far behind on a current dollar basis. So that's point one. Point two, just the way that the Chinese economy works, because it has a very large and dynamic private sector, is more likely to produce competitive innovation than the Soviets ever could.
But there are a couple of things that we could pick up. And one is that the dynamics of Moore's law, which was this relationship that saw silicon chips getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper every year, or you were getting more processing bang for your dollar spent, was a highly socialized process. It required a lot of competitive firms fundamentally collaborating across an ecosystem, not just in California, but in many other parts of the world. And that is a characteristic of a free operating market, which it doesn't feel exists in China, and that within China, they don't have the full stack of market participants when it comes to the semiconductor industry that you need. I think the second challenge I would raise is really about the spirit of research, which ultimately these things are built off really, really basic science. The US still has a lead in pure research, and there are academic freedoms that exist in the US that don't exist in China because the lines of research are not clearly drawn for scientists. There are lines they cannot cross, but they're not told a priori what they might be.
Well, let me come back at you
Yeah.
on both points. The most high-end semiconductors are not manufactured in the United States, as you well know. They're manufactured in Taiwan.
In Taiwan, right.
Which is an island that, according to the People's Republic of China, is part of China. And its contested status, in that sense, is going to be even more explosive than the contested status of Cuba was in the
Right.
early 1960s.
Yeah.
The second point is that scientific talent is quite widely distributed globally, and it's produced in greater volumes in China at this point than it is in the United States. Now, that really didn't matter when the United States was able to attract the talent from all over the world. But one of the consequences of the rise of Cold War II is that process has really broken down. Legal immigration into the United States for talented people has come to a near standstill. So the US is throwing away its opportunity to win Cold War II, and the way to win it is just keep importing the talent, including the talent from China, and then the Chinese can't possibly compete. The Chinese don't have the chance to import talent because nobody wants to emigrate to the People's Republic of China, surprisingly. So this is a really critical point, which brings us to something we haven't talked about yet, which is super important: demographics and migration.
And your point about demographics is that many countries are in retrograde, not just Japan, not just Italy, but also China and large parts of Eastern Europe are well below the replacement rate.
The population of China could fall by as much as half between now and the end of this century. That is a plausible projection from the United Nations if you assume that the fertility rate doesn't go back up. Even the median projection from the UN population prospect says that the population of China will fall by about a third. How can the Chinese economy possibly have sustained growth at even 5% with a shrinking population, a shrinking workforce?
Absolutely.
29% of the economy is building tower blocks, but these are tower blocks for nobody. And I don't think we're thinking enough about what that means.
But we can perhaps bring in one of the technologies we talked about earlier, which was these AI technologies, because of course they are productivity magnifying technologies. At least that's a theory. So let's assume for the discussion that they allow one person to do the work of 3 or 4. That might suggest that countries like China or Italy should invest more heavily in these AI technologies because they are running out of human workers. So could a country like China, with its investments in robotics and AI, use those technologies to in some way defray the downward pressure of this demographics that they're having to deal with?
They are clearly in China investing with that in mind. But I'm not sure that that solves the problem, because I think the problem is somewhat more complex than we don't have enough people to assemble the electric vehicles. There are a couple of other aspects to this which I think are interesting. One is that if you have a population which is aging, you have to be supported by a relatively smaller working population. There are just distributional problems.
Right.
20 years ago, I said the politics of the 21st century will be about generational conflict, not class conflict. And we're still at an early stage of the generational conflicts that are going to play out as younger people say to themselves, wait a second, I seem to be having a pretty hard time in order to support the older generation in very prolonged retirement.
There are strong echoes of that in the US with college debt burden, in the UK with the cost of housing,
Right.
and in France and in Italy as well. And China has got a huge one coming.
It's going to age as rapidly as Japan has, but at a lower level of per capita GDP. I think there are all kinds of really quite unforeseeable problems. So I think that doesn't get solved by robots. And I think there's another problem for aging societies. I mean, it's the young people who have the cool ideas. And if you have an aging population, it seems to me that by definition, you will be less innovative in relative terms.
So historically, are there examples that you can think of where nations or states of some sort have really bet hard on technology to get them out of one of these quite existential threats?
No, this is new territory because the problem in the past was altogether different. Human life expectancy, we forget this, was pretty short for most of history. And so, people didn't feel young at 59. I still kid myself that I'm relatively youthful, at least physically.
You're about to take up a new sport in golf, I understand.
Well, I don't regard golf as a sport, to be honest. But yeah, it's the kind of thing you do when you hit your 60s. But the interesting thing is that all the times of technological innovation that we look back on, as we have in this conversation, happened when societies were extraordinarily youthful by our standards, and the elderly were a really small share of the population.
Where have we got to? There are some new technologies, the internet and artificial intelligence, they feel like a paradigm shift. There are some more linear trends, demographics being a key untold story. And these together are driving a real Cold War II between China and America. Some scholars argue that in many cases where great powers, especially if there are ideological differences that are hard to reconcile, find themselves competing, they will fall into a war.
I think if we're going to rerun this and have Cold War II, we should not assume that we're guaranteed to avoid a hot war. Both societies in their different ways are wrestling with problems of aging that were not familiar to Cold War I participants. The technologies include the old ones, nuclear weapons, but there are a bunch of new ones too.
Hypersonics and AI
missiles,
and cyber.
AI, satellite warfare is going to happen on a
Bio.
far larger scale. So I have to say that I agree with Henry Kissinger, who said to me in an interview not unlike this last year, Cold War II will be more dangerous than Cold War I. That is a very sobering thought to me.
So after the end of World War II, we developed a whole set of new institutions, from the United Nations through to things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you look at the environment that we move into now, is it a case of having to invent new institutions, or is it a case of transforming the ones that we have?
The United Nations, when you look closely at its record, had a structural problem from the outset, namely the veto power of the permanent members.
The full permanent members initially,
and so the permanent members included the United States and the Soviet Union, and so they took turns to exercise that veto, which meant that the UN didn't actually do terribly much that was consequential when it came to avoiding conflict, which is why there were a lot of small and not so small wars during Cold War I.
That's right.
So I think we need to recognize that the UN never really was a terrifically powerful force for preserving peace, that it has been exposed very badly by the war in Ukraine. And let's go down the list. How about the IMF? How is the International Monetary Fund doing when it comes to financial stability? Can I give an F grade? It has, I think, not performed brilliantly, other than perhaps at data collection, not at projection, over the last 20 years. And I'll keep going. The World Trade Organization is basically broken. It's not clear that it can be revived. And so you ask yourself, well, hang on a second, if these institutions are kind of dysfunctional, what was it that generated at least some peace and prosperity after 1945? And I think the answer is, in fact, alliance systems that deterred the Soviets from the more crazy of the plans.
So fundamentally NATO.
NATO mattered much more than the UN, and much more than the European institutions when it came to preserving peace. Therefore, if we want to ask the question, how can we avoid World War III? It is going to be very important that the United States builds a version of NATO for trans-Pacific relations.
Interests are eternal, I think.
Well, this sounds like Henry Kissinger talking right back at me, but I think in practice, this is where the action is. Can the United States create a sufficiently strong network of relationships that China can be deterred from taking the kind of action that could escalate to World War III?
But there were other dimensions of risk that you talked about, and one was artificial intelligence. And even in their non-weaponized state, because they're dual use, they can still be quite dangerous.
Just in the same way that the Peace of Westphalia devised a set of rules to stop religious warfare tearing Europe apart interminably. Why should we not now devise a convention to limit the use of these new and powerful tools, especially now when the United States appears to have a pretty clear lead when it comes to large language models. Just as it was in the interest of the United States to have a non-proliferation treaty before the Soviets overtook the US and nuclear weapons.
Back then, of course, even the Swedes had a nuclear weapons program.
Imagine a world without the non-proliferation treaty. It would have blown up by now.
Right, absolutely. And the Swedes would have reconquered Finland.
In their dreams. In their dreams.
The premise of today's conversation was that if we look back on these few years, we'll realize that we were living through a paradigm shift that was a new age. How do you assess that premise? Is that something that is now going to become reality?
Not in the way that most people think. I think we're at that stage of Cold War II where most people don't fully realize the implications of there being only two AI superpowers, only two superpowers that could conceivably have quantum computers. And that's the real architecture of the rest of our lives. There'll continue to be high levels of trade between the United States and China. You can't decouple these economies entirely, but it'll just be much more selective, and there will be things that won't be tradable. There is a lot of change coming on the back of this new Cold War, and it will affect everything. So even the climate issue inevitably will become part of Cold War II, because you can't avoid climate change if you can't constrain China. So everything ends up being a part of this great geopolitical struggle. This illustrates something that is very important indeed. Some things change because technology changes. The world was changed by the printing press, changed by nuclear weapons, it's being changed by the internet and AI. But certain things remain constant because the logic of power is unaffected by technology. So I think for me, the key to understanding the future is you have to combine historical knowledge with a grasp of what's new, what's technologically different. There's a paradigm shift happening in technology, no question. But the age-old relationships between powers, those don't change. You have to understand both these domains or you will be caught napping.